Today we're going to speak about the nature of forgiveness. And in order to think about this, we're going to speak about the story of Hercules. In the story of Hercules, he has a challenge, which is to fight against the Hydra. The Hydra is a serpent-like being with multiple heads. And as part of this battle, Hercules is tasked with defeating this creature by cutting off its heads. Unfortunately for Hercules, one of the things that goes wrong in this is that whenever you cut off a head of the Hydra, another head, or in some versions of the story, two heads, take its place. And this is very similar to what happens in the spiritual life. There are essentially two serpentine heads that we have to fight with in our spiritual life. One head we are very familiar with. If we are living an ordinary life and living the ordinary spiritual challenges, we are familiar with the false self, so to speak. What in pop spirituality, in the New Age movement or these different types of spirituality, is called the ego. We're familiar with the whole thing of having an identity, which is, we lash out in anger, we want things, we have thoughts and feelings and worries and all these kind of baggage in our mind. We have all this stuff going on. These things draw us in, these thoughts and feelings capture our attention and dictate our lives. Now, that's the first head of the Hydra. So the question becomes, how do we cut off the head of the Hydra? Well, to begin with, we use the sword. And the sword, in a sense, is awareness. When we realize, that we get some distance between ourselves, as they say in Father Coniaris, an Orthodox priest, said, to survey the thoughts is to calm them. That's how he phrased it. To survey the thoughts is to calm them. That's the beginning of the spiritual life, to put that barrier between ourselves and the thoughts. In the teaching of the Orthodox teaching, as they call this nepsis, this watchfulness. In the teaching of acceptance and commitment therapy, this is called thought diffusion. People like Eckhart Tolle speak about this as disidentifying from the mind. This is a very important thing in the case of, working toward forgiveness, because our mind, our identity, is deeply wounded and struck and injured in so many ways. It is lashing out and contorting like a snake, taking on all kinds of forms and throwing up all these different things. And when we try to cut it off, we use the sword of awareness. We cut off the connection between ourselves and the identity of a victim, the identity of wanting to overcome our enemies, the idea that there will be, getting rid of the whole victim idea, that why did God let this happen to me? Why God doesn't care about me? Why did God make this terrible story? When we disidentify from the thought form of the story, we come out of the false narrative and into the wider context of awareness. But the problem is that when we gain this awareness, when we see the story of how, so for example, let's say something happens and we think it's, God provided this, something good happened and maybe something bad happened. We say, God didn't really give me anything good in my life. And, this is a terrible, we make a whole story, a whole identity out of this. But when we realize that this is a kind of a tape loop playing in the mind, when we start to listen to this, we start to realize that there's a difference between the content of our mind and the process of our mind. The fact that we are a person who's having thoughts. We're not just a story that's playing in our head. We start to get that distance between the person and the thoughts. That can become very powerful. Now, the problem is, as we see in the story of the Hydra, when you cut off the head of the Hydra, all of a sudden another head comes up. And that other head is what we call the true self. So there's the false self is one head of the Hydra, and the true self is the other head. Because the lie of the the lies are that you are just your story in your head. The other lie is that you're not your story, that you are unconditioned, you are God. The truth is you are a person, and a person has a body and a history and a soul. It doesn't mean that you are entirely wedded to the ego, nor does it mean that you are entirely not the ego. You are, you're a person, you're a real person. And there needs to be a kind of a moderate approach to these matters. And so we see that when we cut off the head of the serpent, when we cut off that identification with our victim identity, when we cut off our identification with the mind, we have this other temptation, this other serpent's head, which is the head of believing that we are God. This absorption into that awareness, that absorption into the observer. I mean, it could be good to be detached, to be the observer. There's nothing wrong with necessarily the freedom that comes from that. But there's a temptation in it. And that's a very dangerous temptation. And it's a very dangerous temptation because we don't expect it. Once we cut off the head of the serpent, we don't expect the head to grow back. And so that's a very dangerous thing that Elder Sophrony of Essex said, that this experience of the true self, this experience of awareness in the Eastern meditations, is a more dangerous barrier than sin. Because at least when we're sinning and acting foolishly, we think that we're a fool and we think we need help. But the danger is when you cut off this head with awareness, the danger is that you then think that you're God. And so that's danger, and then you think you're perfect. And then you don't repent because you just relax. You kind of just have freedom, but not that you kind of have a halfway type of freedom, which feels like the full way. Because when you enter into the soul feels like God. The absorption and the bliss of freedom in what was in the pop spirituality is called the true self, it feels like God, because the soul is like God. It's infinite, but it's only a created infinity. It's not fully infinite. So what we need to do is we need to use the Hercules' other strategy is to use fire to burn the stump of the head of the serpent, and that is it burns that off the head of the hydra. That fire is prayer. Prayer purifies watchfulness, Father Coniaris says, and watchfulness purifies prayer. These two things go hand in hand. They are like the fruits in the Garden of Eden. Prayer is the tree of life, and watchfulness is the prayer of knowledge. And we need to have these things in the right order, the right context. We can't have knowledge outside of its context, or else we lead into a fall, which makes us become like gods, and our eyes are opened, but we are opened in a false way. And then it becomes like what Jesus says, the light that is within you will become darkness, because it's not the full thing.